This presentation is entitled Checklist for Site Visits, and these are forestry related site visits. Because of all the different issues or types of site visits that you could have, I can't give a checklist for every one of them. This is just going to kind of be for the initial contact to gather initial information and some things to think about during the actual site visit and then the follow-up to the site visit. So the initial contact, of course, can be by phone and email. That's a very common method, and then in person. And this can occur at professional meetings or landowner meetings, but even at churches, at restaurants, standing in line at the Department of Motor Vehicles happen a couple times. Even when you're doing something medical related at the hospital or so forth, you'll make contact with folks. And of course, right, in the hospital, you're probably not going to have time to get the documentation that you need to provide the initial information for the site visit. So you're going to have a second initial contact in many cases. So once here, I always like to let the individual tell me the issue in their own words. Now, sometimes I may politely interrupt them to gather a little bit more information as they're going along, and then they can progress through the issue. And then sometimes you have to steer certain people because they're going to want to get off on tangents, and I have other things to do, but also that's not going to allow me to help them with the issue that they're contacting me when they get off to other issues. One thing is, you know, how often is the property even visited? And this can be important for trespass, but often you'll find a lot of absentee landowners have never even been to the property. Maybe 30 years ago, they used to go there with their aunt. Their aunt, you know, they inherited it from their aunt, but they haven't been there, you know, for 30 years. Is there a gate? Something to consider once again for their own safety, but even for you. But always encourage them to keep records. But during this initial contact, I think you want to gather information about what's happened in the past, the present, that's very important, and then of course the site visit itself, you're going to get the present. But then also you want to, for the site visit and preliminary information that you may be able to send to them to help them, again, have a more informed discussion with you or other professionals, is the future direction of where they want to go. And to me, you want to get all this kind of started before you even conduct the site visit. So property information, who owns the property? And right, you always got to understand the differences if you're dealing with a NIPF landowner versus a state or federal. And then if it's jointly owned, why is it jointly owned? If it's jointly owned, who's representing everybody? Is there heir concerns, both short-term as well as long-term estate planning? Any easements or other contracts that may dictate operations on the property? And as I'm going through here, you don't necessarily need to be an expert on all of these issues. In my opinion, you just need to know enough to make them aware that these are very important things that they need to address, probably not necessarily always with you, but with other professionals, with their attorney, with their consulting forester, with their CPA. So how was the property acquired? Was it purchased, inherited, or gifted? That can be important for income tax basis. When was the property acquired? Who owns the surrounding property? Are there disputes with neighbors? Could this landowner access their neighbor property if needed? Legal description, I think, is always a good thing. Now, if you're doing a yard tree site visit, right, maybe you don't need the legal description. But to me, if you're dealing with a forestry setting, you want to get the legal description. That's the United States Public Land Survey, I believe, here in Mississippi, meets and bounds, maybe in other places, and then ARPANS even. But that can help you with information like soil surveys and things like that as well. And then what's the acres in total, but also acres by forest cover type. And then are there other operations going on? Are the property boundaries marked? Were they surveyed? And once again, you don't need to have all this information, doesn't necessarily need to be determined right here at the initial contact, and often it won't be, but you're at least helping them gather information that they're going to need going forward when they're talking with other professionals. And when was the property acquired? How was the property acquired? Even like if they inherited it from their parents, how did their parents get the property? And so forth. All of that's important at some level with you, but also going forward. Once again, in my opinion, you're helping them going forward beyond just your site visit. Make sure they have an understanding of the issue and why is the issue important to them. Why are they doing what they're doing? Often landowners are going to want you to tell them, what do I need to do? Well, or what should I be doing? But, I think it's up to them to set their own future direction. What are their desired objectives? That can help them have a better understanding of what they can gain from you and what they can gain from other professionals. And always be careful about the level of advice that you're giving. You're not necessarily a CPA or an attorney or so forth, so be careful with what the level you're giving them. Do they have a management plan? Does the management plan have a profit motive? That could be important for income taxes. Once again, what are their desired future forest conditions? They need to identify. You can help them identify that, but they need to identify that. Do they work with a professional, consulting forester, a CPA? Do they have an attorney? And so we don't really do management plans here at Mississippi State, at least. So they need to work with other people. But I can at least get them alternatives that they can think about. Once again, I'm helping them gather that information that they're going to need when they're working with those other professionals. And I'm always going to recommend that they work with consulting foresters and not loggers directly. Do they understand the cost involved? Do they understand who's going to pay for those costs? Do they understand who's going to receive revenues? Do they understand capital gains, long-term and short-term? Who will be impacted by the income taxes, by the cost, by the revenues? I've had cases where a person lived in another state, and they had timber owned in another state. What income tax issues going on there? So they need, once again, you don't need to be an expert on all of that, but you need to let them know that's going to be an issue. Estate planning or taxes, right? Do they have an accountant, a CPA? Do they understand the legal ramifications of contracts, easements, forest carbon markets? If they're signing up for 40 or 100-year contracts, do they understand the legal implications? Once again, you don't need to know all that, but you need to let them know that they need to talk with an attorney for issues related to future harvest or passing of the property to heirs and so forth. Neighborhood covenants can become an issue, cost shares that they might be involved with, and do they even have the legal right to conduct operations and activities? And 13 is a very complicated one. I've had actually a couple landowners contact me where they were buying property that was under contract with a logger from the previous owner. And that, in my opinion, once again, they need to talk. If they're thinking about buying the property, they need to talk with a lawyer or an attorney and make sure they understand what are all the ramifications to that. And I think sometimes, too, during this initial contact, be careful. If you feel like there's an issue, meeting with this individual could create a problem for you professionally going forward, maybe legally or politically, or for the university, if you're working for a university or a company, that you could get them into legal or political issues, I would definitely ask my superiors and let them know. Maybe you should not be representing the university or your company, and you need to watch what you say, because legally you could get into some issues. Do you want to be confronting the Corps of Engineers on wetlands? Right? Do you want to get in the middle of a boundary dispute between two landowners, between a landowner and a state and a government entity, that maybe you don't want to be in that issue? Beyond that, though, maybe you can be at the issue, but you have to make sure that you set boundaries. And here's just a couple of examples. I mean, if there's a tree that could fall on somebody's house, do you necessarily want to be giving advice for that tree? In my opinion, particularly if you're not a certified arborist, you need to sometimes take a step back and maybe set boundaries as to what information you feel comfortable with and what information you really have the knowledge and expertise to be providing. And here's just some examples about if you're meeting for like a plantation. There's all kinds of issues that are pretty hard to give a specific site visit checklist. Definitely this is going to apply in many cases to a variety of issues, and then naturally regenerated. And not just plantations, I should say, seeding or acorns, if you're talking about hardwoods and so forth. And then many of these are going to cross over. But these are just some issues that I usually bring up when I'm meeting with the landowner for particular issues. And then I think safety. Some of the urban areas that folks may work in can be very dangerous. So I think you need to make sure that you feel comfortable going there, or at least letting somebody know that you're going there. If you're often going to remote locations, make sure you know who you're meeting with. And beyond that, make sure that you know that their neighbors know that you might be there. Or sometimes you may meet with a landowner, but they didn't tell their family that you're coming out there. And they don't know that you're there. And their uncle lives next door on the property, and literally he comes out with a shotgun, or he calls the police. So make sure that you're aware of all these situations, because in some cases it can be kind of dangerous when you're going onto people's property. And also, if you're working in ice storm damage or tornado damage, hurricane damage, remember, depending on your job description, you don't necessarily need to be inventorying or trudging through all that. Those are safety hazards. So once again, set boundaries. And I'm always going to want to take the work truck if I can. That can help with issues with trespass and neighbors and in these areas. Just letting people know that you're there on official business, and you probably want to wear like a work shirt if you have one. I think that helps people know that you're on official business. Thank you.